These video Bible lessons may contain copyrighted material, the use of which has not always been specifically authorized by the copyright owner. I am making such material available in an effort to advance the understanding of scriptural matters as pertains to an individual's spiritual walk. I believe this constitutes a fair use of any such copyrighted material as provided for in Section 107 of the U.S. Copyright Law. In accordance with Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, the material in these videos are distributed without profit, to those who have expressed an interest in receiving the included information, for research and educational purposes, as well as spiritual edification. God sends a deliverer. God will always deliver his people when they call upon his name. We now leave Genesis, the book of beginnings, to study the other books of the Pentateuch, or the 5 books of law. Exodus describes the exit or departure of Israel from Egypt. Leviticus, relating to the Levites, teaches the holiness of God and how to properly approach him. Numbers is so named because the Israelite fighting force was twice numbered. Chapter 1 verses 2 through 46, and chapter 26 verses 2 through 51, this book describes Israel's 40-year wilderness journey at Sinai, their murmuring and unbelief. Deuteronomy, or the second law, records Moses' farewell address. This book prepared Israel to enter the promised land and encouraged them to renew their covenant with God. Exodus opens with God's covenant people awaiting deliverance from a pagan land. As we begin this practical study of the everyday life, struggles and temptations of the Israelites, remember, God is not nearly so concerned with what we go through as he is in how we respond to life's varied situations. Will we rebel, complain, and criticize, or allow him to be our Lord and ruler? In each of their difficulties, imagine yourself to be in Israel's place. What would you do? How would you respond to the problem? Could you be patient and understanding, or would you also be overcome with doubts and unbelief? But why were they in Egypt? Did a loving God intend for his chosen ones to be cruelly treated and enslaved? Had Israel and his sons remained in grandfather Abraham's promised land, they would have died during the severe famine. In Egypt, they had flourished into a large nation. Fulfilling the promise made to Abraham, they had begun to multiply as the stars of heaven and sand on the seashore. And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Exodus 1 verse 7. Why then should the Israelites endure oppression and slavery? God's purpose was to illustrate the benefits associated with affliction. Slavery toughened them for the wilderness journey and weaned them from Egypt's prosperity. Without persecution, Israel might never have departed from their adopted land. As the whips of the Egyptian taskmasters lashed across their backs, thoughts of Canaan became more enticing. As the Hebrew slaves became more miserable, their sighs and cries blended into a groan, and God heard their groaning. Suffering has the special quality of refining the heart. David said, "Before I was afflicted I went astray, but now have I kept thy word." Psalm 119 verse 67. Do you suppose that 21st century pressures and problems might also be toughening us for troublesome times just ahead? Paul reminded us, "All things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are the called according to his purpose." Romans 8 verse 28. Satan had sought to destroy the promised seed of the woman. Knowing that Abraham had been specified in that lineage, the enemy determined to destroy his descendants. When a pharaoh came to the throne who knew not Joseph, this was the devil's chance. Fearing that the Israelites would join with an enemy king in time of war, the pharaoh oppressed the Israelites, hoping to stunt their rapid growth. But during strenuous labor, they multiplied. Then the Hebrew midwives were ordered to kill every male child at birth. But they feared God and would not obey the command. Finally, Pharaoh commanded the Egyptians to report the birth of male Hebrew babies, whereupon, the infants would be drowned in the Nile River. Birth of Moses. Exodus 2 verses 1 through 10. Paradoxically, the same measure chosen to destroy Israel affected their deliverance. About this time, Amram and Jochebed, a godly couple of Levi's tribe, were blessed with a fine baby boy. Something about this tiny son seemed special. They saw he was a proper child, Hebrews 11 verse 23, and determined to keep him. After concealing their baby at home for 3 months, Jochebed constructed a small chest-like ark of bulrushes, or papyrus plants, and sealed it with pitch. Her son became the ark's precious cargo laid among reeds at the Nile's bank. What faith! How could a child be preserved where Pharaoh had directed that he be killed? The tiny ark was strategically placed where the princess usually bathed. Miriam, the child's sister, was instructed to watch. When the baby began to cry, motherly instincts were instantly aroused in the princess' heart. She determined to rescue for herself this one Hebrew boy. Quickly Miriam offered to find a nursemaid, and Moses' own mother received wages for doing what most pleased her. The princess named the baby Moses, meaning, "I drew him out of the water." Moses' most beneficial education was from his God-fearing mother. He learned precious truths and stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. No doubt Jochebed impressed upon her son that soon they would leave this terrible place of slavery to possess a promised land. In the East, children are usually nursed the first 3 years. Moses' mother had a short time to teach her son, but it was his only parental instruction about God's ways. The child was adopted by the princess and given a royal education. Moses' parents had hoped only that he live. Never did they dream that he would become great, wise, rich, well-educated and powerful. Thus, God turned Satan's evil scheme to be the means of deliverance for his chosen people. Pharaoh provided free lodging and education to the very man who would accomplish what Pharaoh was trying to prevent. From Adam to Christ, no one accomplished more than Moses. He is among the few Bible characters whose life is sketched from infancy to death. God's early dealings with Israel were transacted as Yahweh spoke face to face with this prophet, priest, and king. As Moses matured to adulthood, he surely dreamed of ascending Egypt's throne and instantly liberating his enslaved people. But such was not God's way. Once while visiting a royal construction project, the young Hebrew observed the inhuman treatment of his people. What should he do? Should he ignore their plight to seek his own fame and prestige among the Egyptians? Remembering his mother's teaching, Moses made the wisest choice of his life. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God, than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. Hebrews 11 verses 24 through 26. Having made his decision, at the age of 40 years, Moses launched into his role of deliverer but without divine mission or command. In retribution to merciless treatment of his kinsmen, he reacted and killed an Egyptian taskmaster and hid the body in a shallow grave. The following day he tried to settle a Hebrew dispute. But one asked, "Do you intend to kill me as you did the Egyptian?" With the secret exposed, Moses was compelled to escape for his life. Moses fled to Midian. His Egyptian education completed, now he enrolled in God's Wilderness University. God calls Moses. Exodus 3 verses 1 through 4 and chapter 17. Toward the end of Moses' exile, another Pharaoh came to the throne. God was ready to deliver his people. Once while tending his sheep, a spectacular sight arrested Moses' attention. A wild acacia bush was enveloped in flames but was not consumed. As Moses investigated, the angel of the Lord spoke from the burning bush, "Moses, do not come near. Put off your shoes, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses had to learn of God's holiness and that he must always be approached with reverence and awe. Trembling, Moses hid his face. God spoke, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have seen the affliction of my people and I am come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey. I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people out of Egypt." Delivering Israel was exactly what he had wanted to do 40 years ago. But now he felt inferior to the task. Graciously the Lord promised, "Certainly I will be with thee." Then Moses questioned what name of authority should be given. Who was the God of his fathers? Until then, he had been known as Elohim, Shaddai, or Yahweh. His new name would be I Am That I Am, meaning He who alone exists. The great I Am is one God. After centuries, Yahweh introduced himself as a personal, living being ready to fulfill the covenant promises. Every new revelation of God's name from this time forward provides a fuller and clearer understanding: Yahweh Jireh, Yahweh Nissi, Yahweh Shalom. Each compounded name reveals such attributes as provision, righteousness, healing, peace, and others. When Moses' self-inadequacy persisted, God furnished a threefold reply that would silence his critics and encourage Moses himself. For the first time, a man was empowered to draw attention to God's greatness through the working of miracles. God commanded Moses to throw his ordinary shepherd's staff to the ground. But at God's command to grasp the serpent by the tail, it again became a rod in Moses' hand. A second sign involved Moses' hand. First it became leprous, then cleansed. The third sign was power to turn the Nile water to blood. To Moses' excuse of having a speech defect, the Lord appointed Aaron, Moses' brother, as spokesman. With a divine commission, Moses returned to Egypt with his wife and 2 sons. Before reaching his destination, however, Moses learned another important lesson. The covenant sign of circumcision had been neglected in one of his sons. While the family lodged for the night, Moses was suddenly stricken ill as the Lord sought to kill him. Exodus 4 verse 24, when he and his wife perceived the purpose for the sickness, Zipporah herself performed the rite. Immediately, Moses recovered. To be a lawgiver and leader, Moses must observe God's first command to Abraham. Without circumcision, an Israelite was alienated from the covenant. Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh. Exodus 5 verses 1 through 9, and chapter 7 verses 10 through 13. Back at Egypt, the two brothers met with the elders of Israel to deliver a divine message. The time had finally arrived to leave Egypt for their long-promised home. Then began the mightiest conflict in history. On one side was arrayed the power, wealth, and splendor of Egypt and its paganism. On the other was a poor, aged, discredited man and his brother. Through the palace gates they went, asking the king to liberate 3 million people. At first the Egyptians must have scoffed and ridiculed. But soon their laughter would be turned to anxiety and then to pounding fear. Haughtily Pharaoh asked, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." Exodus 5 verse 2. Unrelenting, Moses and Aaron presented persuasive reasons. But the pair were accused of inciting Hebrew laborers to discontent. Their labor was doubled. Formerly, straw had been provided. Now they must find stubble to make the bricks. Incidentally, archaeologists have uncovered Egyptian buildings with bricks made of stubble rather than straw, as recorded in Exodus 5 verse 12. Doubtless, this book was written by someone who knew the facts. Often the path to deliverance winds through the valley of deeper trouble. But God instructed Moses to quit begging or pleading. Deliverance strategy was about to commence. Moses and Aaron would contend against the gods of Egypt and magical heathen arts. When Pharaoh demanded to see a miracle, Aaron threw Moses' rod to the ground and it became a serpent. The sorcerers and magicians performed a similar feat, but Aaron's rod swallowed up theirs. Had he chosen to, the Lord could have instantly slain Pharaoh and all his people. Instead, he patiently exhibited supernatural power to prove the inferiority of the gods of Egypt and that he alone was worthy of worship. Pharaoh had inquired, "Who is the Lord?" "I know not the Lord." After the completion of the 10 plagues, the two would be well acquainted. Plagues of Egypt. Exodus 7 verse 14 and chapter 11 verse 10. Egyptian gods differed from deities of surrounding countries. Egypt's idolatrous religion was morally and spiritually degrading. Each Egyptian god and goddess was depicted having human bodies and animal heads. The bull, lion, ram, cat, wolf, dog, vulture, falcon, crocodile, cobra, frog, locust, and other animals and insects were considered sacred. Unlike other Eastern rulers, the Egyptian pharaoh did not rule for the gods, but was literally one of the gods. Naturally, a request for Israel's release would be rejected. The first plague occurred as Pharaoh was offering his customary worship to the sacred Nile, the father of life. Emphatically, Moses announced that his people must be released or the Nile would turn to blood. As Aaron stretched his rod over the Nile, every canal, pond, and container of stored water turned into blood. The whole population would have soon died of thirst. How embarrassing for the poor gods. Pharaoh's magicians counterfeited this miracle, but they were powerless to change the blood-red Nile to its original condition. For 7 days, the river, once defiled with the blood of innocent Hebrew babies, was a mass of stinking pollution. Then unexpectedly, God withdrew the plague. The consequences for Pharaoh's next refusal was an epidemic of frogs. Deified as a goddess, the presence of small croaking frogs normally assured a good harvest. But this epidemic greatly interrupted the comfort and happiness of the extremely clean Egyptians. The sacred little creatures could not be killed, and they were everywhere: houses, beds, kneading troughs, ovens. Pharaoh's magicians did the same with their enchantments, but were powerless to remove the plague. In desperation, Pharaoh promised that if Moses and Aaron's God would prevent the plague, they could go and offer sacrifices. His knowledge of the Lord seemed to be improving. But when the plague ended and the heaps of frogs were buried, Pharaoh denied his promise. The third plague swarmed Egypt. As Aaron's rod struck the ground, the dust turned to gnats, an almost invisible insect with a very annoying sting. Authorities believe that lice should have been translated as gnats or mosquitoes. Egypt's fertile, worshipped soil had become a curse. Man and beast were driven to madness by these tiny pests. But when Pharaoh assembled his magicians, the contest ended. Humbly they confessed this miracle to be the finger of God. Next came a plague of flies. From this plague, the Israelites and their property were protected. In despair, Pharaoh offered a compromise of allowing the people to go just a short distance. But when the flies were gone, he reneged. A highly contagious cattle disease then infected the cattle, horses, donkeys, oxen, and sheep. All livestock in the field or open air died. Although the Egyptian cows, bulls, rams and goats were considered sacred, their gods were helpless to defend them from this judgment. But not one head of cattle in Israel was affected. Still, Pharaoh refused to allow Israel freedom. As Moses and Aaron threw ashes heavenward, a sixth plague opened, running boils appeared on men and beasts. Even Pharaoh's magicians were too grotesque to answer his call at the royal court. The seventh plague was an unprecedented, violent hailstorm. A peculiar electrical display similar to fireballs and hail filled all the land except Goshen. Flax and barley crops were totally destroyed. And the sky goddess was unable to intervene. So impressed was Pharaoh by this hail, he confessed, "I have sinned this time, the Lord is righteous, and I and my people are wicked." Exodus 9 verse 27. However, when Moses raised his hands and the rain, hail, and thunder ceased, Pharaoh's penitence and promise were broken. Patiently Moses issued a new warning. If Pharaoh continued to balk, locusts would infest the earth. Royal servants joined the plea this time to release the people. But only an empty compromise was given, then withdrawn. Locust plagues were so fearsome in ancient Egypt that peasants prayed to a locust god. A locust can daily eat its own weight in volume. 1 square mile might contain 100 to 200 million insects, and a swarm might occupy an area of 400 square miles. Egypt's crops, fruits, and trees were stripped down to trunks and limbs. But when a strong west wind drove them into the Red Sea, Pharaoh cancelled the release of the Israelites. In the ninth judgment, the Lord fought the entire host of divinities. Re, the sun god, was Egypt's most superior. As Moses stretched his hand toward heaven, a thick darkness that could be felt covered the land. Exodus 10 verse 21. For 3 days the Egyptians suffered severe mental anguish. However, the Israelites, furnished with plenty of light, were preparing for the greatest event of their lives. To Pharaoh's call, Moses and Aaron rejected another compromise. But they announced the final plague, death to the firstborn of man and beast alike. Moses predicted the exact hour, the anguish, and ultimate expulsion of the Israelites from Egypt. The final stroke would set Israel free. Passover. Exodus 12 verses 1 through 36, and verses 41 through 51. While Egypt was under a plague of thick darkness, Israelites busily prepared to initiate a new ordinance. The Passover is more frequently mentioned in the New Testament than any other ordinance. As the last and most dreadful plague was readied, God introduced the plan whereby he would redeem man from sin, the blood of atonement, meaning to cover man's sins. Notice in the Passover story the many comparisons with the coming Lamb of God. God instructed that a selected lamb would be offered as a substitute for the firstborn child. The lamb must be an unblemished year-old male. To ensure its perfect condition, it must be penned up for 4 days and then inspected. Each lamb must be killed in the evening and roasted with fire. All the flesh must be eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. If one lamb was too much for a family to eat, it must be shared with another household to prevent waste. As they ate, everyone must stand around a table, clad with shoes and staffs, ready for travel. No Israelite could leave the house until morning. Only inside a home protected by a lamb's blood would they be safe. Before eating the meal, each family leader must sprinkle the lamb's blood on the 2 posts and lintel of the doorway. Animal blood had no innate cleansing power, but it declared the necessity of a blood covering for sin. The entire Passover story illustrated that Christ would be sent to earth as God's perfect lamb. His sinless blood would cover and cleanse us from sin. As Paul wrote, "Once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." Hebrews 9 verse 26. At midnight, the Lord himself went through the land, executing judgment against the firstborn and all the gods of Egypt. Exodus 12 verse 12. Only those protected by the blood were passed over. An angry God was in the streets that night. In a sense, all the firstborn were slain, both in Israel and Egypt. The Egyptian firstborn died in person while the Israelite firstborn were redeemed by a substituted sacrificial lamb. The death of Pharaoh's son shocked the palace servants. There lay the pale, lifeless form of the boy who supposedly was born of the gods. Finally, Pharaoh's stubborn will was broken. Calling for Moses and Aaron, he urged Israel to leave immediately. All the people must exit with their flocks and herds. At God's command, the Israelites went to their Egyptian neighbors and borrowed, or more correctly requested, jewels of silver and gold and clothing. Gladly the Egyptians parted with their possessions. Anything to remove these mysterious Israelites far out of their sight. God had previously said to Moses, "And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall come to pass, that, when ye go, ye shall not go empty, but every woman shall borrow of her neighbor jewels of silver, and jewels of gold, and raiment. And ye shall spoil the Egyptians." Exodus 3 verses 21 and 22. The conquering nation was awarded the spoils of her enemy. However, in exchange for a century of slavery, this was actually small payment. Would they really need such wealth in the wilderness? Oh yes. Much of the gold and silver would be used to construct the tabernacle. Jewels would adorn the garments of the high priest. Instead of leaving as fugitives, they marched out like conquerors, dressed in splendor. Because of unbelief, a trip that should have been completed in 2 years, took 40 years. Israel leaves Egypt. After spending more than 400 years in Egypt, the Israelites were headed toward their promised land. The morning after the 10th judgment, the Israelites began emerging from all parts of Goshen. Knowing that the people had rapidly multiplied, they may have numbered from 3 to 5 million. There was not one feeble person among their tribes. Psalm 105 verse 37. Imagine that all those ex-slaves, all in perfect health. Included in their ranks, perhaps they were other enslaved Semites living in Egypt, or native Egyptians wishing to escape Pharaoh's tyranny. Or they may have been descendants of intermarried Egyptians and Hebrews. Before becoming God's peculiar treasure and model to all nations, Israel had to learn about laws for holy living, acceptable worship, how to get along with one another, discipline, obedience to Moses, and military training. No one can successfully live for God without spending much time in Bible study and prayer. A cloud pillar ascending from earth to heaven led the Israelites. When it stopped moving, so must they. When it moved forward, they followed. When darkness fell, it became a brilliant column of fire. Crossing Red Sea. Exodus 14 verses 1 through 31. Once the initial shock of the midnight slaughter had subsided, Pharaoh again changed his mind. Why had he freed those laborers and highly skilled craftsmen? Thus the order was given for 600 royal chariots to pursue and return them to Egypt. As the sun was setting, war chariots were seen coming from the north. Escape was impossible. The sea was on the east, mountains were on the south and west, and Israel was unarmed. Immediately, everyone began crying to God and complaining to Moses for this dangerous predicament. Why had he led them into this trap? Moses answered, "Don't be afraid. Stand still and see what the Lord will do for you." Moses lifted his rod over the sea. As he did, a strong east wind divided the waters into walls on either side and dried the seabed. Then the Lord troubled the Egyptians with a sudden cloudburst, thunder, and lightning. Psalm 77 verses 17 through 19. Again, Moses' hand was uplifted and the wall of water on either side, Exodus 15 verse 8, fell. The waves engulfed the struggling Egyptians and horses. They sank into the mighty waters. For the first time, Israel stood as a redeemed nation, completely separated from Egypt. Israel's deliverance illustrates our redemption from sin through Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. At the Passover, Israel was spared from death by the blood of a lamb. They were separated from the old life by passing through the Red Sea, stepping on the shore marked entry into new territory of God's promised blessings. Calling upon the Lord, repenting and committing our lives to His control is the first step of redemption. Water baptism separates us from the old life of sin. As we enter the new life of salvation, many promised spiritual gifts and blessings are available, but we must claim them. When upon the other shore, Moses and his people viewed the strewn debris and corpses of their enemy. What a mighty God they served! Spontaneously, the redeemed nation sang praises unto the Lord. Miriam, Moses' 90-year-old sister, led the women with dancing, singing, and playing tambourines. What a joyful chorus! God's covenant people were free at last. Bitter waters made sweet. Exodus 15 verses 22 through 26. Israel stood on a new continent with God as their king. Because the covenant people's spiritual life was undeveloped, God manifested himself through their physical senses. Until one's dead spirit is quickened, or made alive, a person cannot understand spiritual concepts. Repeatedly, the children of Israel murmured, complained, and rebelled against the principles God desired to teach. Then occurred a water shortage in the camp. Triumphant praise to God was followed by fear. We may also expect our faith to be tested after leaving the life of sin. Water was found, but it tasted bitter. Why would God permit Israel to suffer such hardships? There he proved them. Exodus 15 verse 25. Would they be patient and obedient, or would they murmur and complain? Most problems are merely God's teaching tools. God instructed Moses to cast a certain tree into the water and it would become sweet. The healing of these bitter waters was a sign to Israel that God was also able and willing to heal their bodies. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them, and said, If thou wilt diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and wilt do that which is right in his sight, and wilt give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee, which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. Exodus 15 verses 25 and 26. A close examination of Israel's covenant of healing reveals that God was actually offering them immunity from sickness. But notice a special condition. It applied only for those who diligently listened and obeyed the Lord's commandments and statutes. Immunity from disease was linked to personal responsibility. Only days later at Sinai, God gave instructions regarding a day of rest, health habits, diet, and cleanliness. All these rules were vital for preventing sickness. To emphasize the importance of healthy bodies, God mentioned again at Sinai, And ye shall serve the Lord your God, and he shall bless thy bread, and thy water, and I will take sickness away from the midst of thee. There shall nothing cast their young, nor be barren, in thy land, the number of thy days I will fulfill. Exodus 23 verses 25 and 26. Healthy, strong bodies are intended for God's chosen people. And the promise of healing is based upon conditions. Manna and quail given. Exodus 16 verses 1 through 36. Traveling on through the dry wilderness, Israel found 12 bubbling wells of water surrounded by groves of palm trees. A place called Elim provided a season of calm and contentment. Remember that persecutions and troubles also are seasonal. They won't last forever. After a month, they marched toward Sinai. In this barren desert, all provisions brought from Egypt were depleted. Starvation seemed certain. Again, their faith failed and the Hebrews complained against Moses and Aaron. Would that God had smitten us with a painless death as he did the firstborn of the Egyptians rather than this awful, lingering death from starvation, they moaned. That evening, the sky darkened and an enormous flight of quail fell to the ground about their tents. The following morning, they received bread. Until they reached Canaan 40 years later, for 6 days every week, Israel received daily bread. The people called it manna, meaning it is a gift from heaven. Early in the morning, each person was instructed to gather an omer, about 2 quarts, of manna per day. It could be ground or beaten. Their diet was supplemented from their large flocks and herds. Not only was God supplying their food, but he was also training them to depend upon him. Having been slaves many years, now each week they experienced a day of rest. This special day was to be observed throughout their generations. The Jewish Sabbath was an absolute day of holy rest. Before reaching Mount Sinai, the people again clamored for water. This time Moses was told to strike a certain rock with his rod and water gushed forth. Law and Tabernacle. Exodus 19 verse 1 and chapter 40 verse 38. In the third month, or about 6 weeks after leaving Egypt, they reached the Sinai Peninsula, the familiar country where Moses had lived for 40 years. Surrounded by majestic cliffs, this 2-mile wide, well-irrigated plain became Israel's camping ground and schoolhouse for the next year. Here God gave his laws and provided blueprints for the tabernacle. 12 spies sent. Numbers 13 verse 1 and chapter 14 verse 45. Israel left Sinai organized and prepared for victory. Preceded by the tabernacle, they marched tribe by tribe, to their next encampment. Within 3 days, the complaining resumed. God's displeasure was shown by an outbreak of fire on the outskirts of the camp. Moses' prayer quenched the fire. But still they complained. They wanted a menu change. When quail was provided, their overindulgence caused sickness. Large numbers died from a plague. Had they expressed gratitude for their miraculous blessings, how different Israel's history would have been. Finally, the complaining spirit was displayed by Moses' own sister and brother. Miriam became leprous for criticizing Moses' superior position. But when her brother humbly begged for God's mercy, she was healed. About 16 months after leaving Egypt, the tribes stood on the threshold of Canaan. Soon they would possess their long-expected inheritance. At Kadesh Barnea, 12 spies, or scouts, were appointed, a man from each tribe, to closely examine the territory. 40 days later they returned with tales of a highly advanced civilization, fertile land, beauty, and fruitfulness. 2 men brought a large cluster of grapes on a pole to prove the land's fertility. Had the report ended there, all would have been well. But 10 of the men began to tell every discouragement they had seen. There were walled cities and giants in the land, reported the 10 spies. We were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Numbers 13 verse 33. Caleb and Joshua tried to encourage the panic-stricken people. Let us go up at once, and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. Numbers 13 verse 30. Unbelief's short-sightedness always sees the difficulties while faith looks past them and sees God. The 10 spies never thought of nor saw God. The negative report spread swiftly through the tents. By nightfall, the whole congregation was weeping like children. As word spread of appointing a new leader to lead them back to Egypt, Joshua and Caleb tried to calm them. But it was impossible. Just as they were ready to stone Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb, suddenly the glory of God appeared before the tabernacle. In this most crucial hour, God offered to make Moses a new nation and destroy the people. But their leader stood in the gap and prayed for his people. Because of his intercessory prayer, God forgave the people, but none above the age of 20 would be allowed to enter the promised land. According to the number of days in which the spies searched the land, a year for each day, they would wander in the wilderness and finally die. Then with no warning, the 10 unbelieving spies died by a plague. This act of God so moved the people, they decided it would be wise to go forward and possess the land. Brazen serpent. Numbers 21 verses 4 through 9. Little is known about events of the next 38 years. But, in one occurrence there was an organized conspiracy of leaders with a group of rebels led by Korah and another by Dathan and Abiram. Both groups complained about Moses and Aaron's leadership. Why should they exercise so much authority over the congregation? Their stubborn rebellion was punished in a most unusual way. The earth opened beneath the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, devouring their entire families and goods. Simultaneously, the fire of God from the tabernacle flashed like lightning, killing 250 other rebels. The day following, when the people blamed Moses and Aaron for the rebels' deaths, another 14,700 were slain by a plague. Shortly before the 40 years had expired, the people begged again for water. Irritated and exhausted with their unbelief, he was told to gather the congregation and speak to the same rock that had previously flowed. Instead, Moses struck the rock as he had done before and water gushed out. But he had disobeyed God's command. Tenderly God dealt with his disobedient servant. Because of his unbelief and disobedience, he was prohibited from entering Canaan. Shortly after Aaron died, the people again tired of the heavenly manna. This time there was no miraculous supply fulfilling their request. Instead, they were punished with fiery serpents. When people began dying from the bites, they repented, and urged Moses to pray for them. In response to Moses' prayer, a unique healing plan was revealed to cure the bites. A brass replica of a serpent was to be mounted on a pole in the middle of the camp. By looking at the brass serpent, anyone who had been bitten would be healed. Healing power was not in the brass serpent itself, but in obeying God's plan. Jesus used the story of the brazen serpent to illustrate his future death. By looking to our crucified Savior on the cross, we can obtain both healing for the body and salvation for the soul. John 3 verses 14 through 17. The Old Covenant, or the Old Testament. The basis of this covenant is the Ten Commandments. Fifth Dispensation, Law. Let's return to Mount Sinai, Israel's temporary schoolhouse. Israel arrived there in the third month, or about 6 weeks after leaving Egypt. Jews have traditionally observed the anniversary of the giving of law with the Feast of Pentecost. On that same holy day hundreds of years later, the gift of the Holy Spirit was given, marking the Church's origin and the fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts, and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. Jeremiah 31 verses 31 through 33. Sinai set the scene of the Mosaic covenant. Moses was eager to ascend its jagged peaks. 3 times in a single chapter, we read an account of Moses climbing this mountain for a rendezvous with God and then returning with a message for the people. Exodus 19 verses 3, 8, and 20. On Moses' first trip, God disclosed his intention of renewing the Abrahamic covenant. The Israelites were spiritually dead. No one had regained the quality of life which Adam at first had experienced. Israel must be told in detail what would please God and what would not. They must obey the voice of the Lord, accept and keep his covenant. Then they would be to him a special treasure above all others. Furthermore, the Lord would make them a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, examples, instructors, and prophets to the heathen world. Circumcision remained the outward sign of this consecration. Inwardly, they were to be pure and holy, preserving the knowledge of the one true God. Would they accept this agreement? Moses explained the preparations for receiving God's law. For the next 3 days the people must abstain from all sensual pleasure, wash their bodies and clothes. A fence must be erected around the mountain, separating it from the people. Should man or beast touch the mountain, they would die. Such strict punishments exemplified reverence for a holy God. On the third day, a voice like a trumpet sounded while the whole mountain smoked and burned with fire. Deuteronomy 4 verses 11 and 12. Again the Lord warned Moses against the people touching the mountain. Moses then ascended the mount. There he received ordinances for the completion of the covenant and precise details of the principles contained in the 10 Commandments. Here are the 3 divisions of the law. Moral law relates to rules of right conduct. The moral law is basically found in the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20 verses 1 through 17. Civil law relates to the rights and duties of citizens of a community, Exodus, chapters 21 through 23. Ceremonial law relates to religious ceremonies or rituals, principally in the book of Leviticus. Beginning with Exodus 20 verse 22 through chapter 23, various civil, social and religious laws were spoken privately to Moses. God commanded Moses to write the covenant laws in a book known as the Book of the Covenant. The book was read to all the people for them to respond to Yahweh's offer. They agreed to obey. To formally ratify the covenant, burnt sacrifices were offered on an altar. Half the blood was sprinkled on the altar and Book of the Covenant, and the other half on the people. 10 Commandments. Exodus 20 verses 1 through 17. The 10 Commandments are the basis of the divine law which Israel accepted as the charter of their new constitution. The remainder of the law was communicated privately to Moses and later delivered to the people. These commandments were engraved on both sides of 2 tablets of stone, written with the finger of God, and kept for centuries in the Ark of the Covenant. These commandments have guided the majority of civilized societies since that time. 4 commandments relate to our attitude toward God. The other 6 deal with our attitudes toward other people. Jesus condensed them into 2 commandments. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. Luke 10 verses 25 through 28. Here is a summary of the 10 Commandments. 1. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. This emphasizes man's first duty. Money, pleasure, fashion, fame, gluttony, or any other god must never replace the true God. Every man, woman, boy, and girl must be committed to love and obey him. 2. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. No visible representations of deity are to be made or worshipped. The Lord is a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the 3rd and 4th generation of them that hate me, and shewing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. Exodus 20 verses 5 and 6. 3. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. The irreverent use of God's name by false or profane swearing is forbidden. His name is to be esteemed absolutely sacred and must never be used casually or light-heartedly. 4. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. Both man and beasts should work 6 days and rest 1 day. The Jewish Sabbath was designed as a day for family members and servants to worship and praise the Lord. The early church observed the first day of the week for worship and rest and called it the Lord's Day. The ceremonial Sabbath is no longer in effect, Colossians 2 verses 16 and 17, and Romans 14 verse 5. Under the new covenant, Jesus provides a spiritual Sabbath of rest when we are baptized in the Holy Ghost, Matthew 11 verses 28 through 30, and Isaiah 28 verses 11 and 12. 5. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land. Children must reverence and obey their parents. Juvenile delinquency was intolerable under the law. To honor means, to obey, to give the place of superiority, to hold in high esteem, to reverence. The responsibility rests with the parents to train their children morally and spiritually to obey this commandment. 6. Thou shalt not kill. Because man was made in the image of God, human life is considered sacred. Both suicide and the murder of a fellow man are prohibited. However, capital punishment is scriptural since the guilty murderer has destroyed one made in God's image, James 3 verse 9. 7. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Marriage, the highest and most sacred of human relations, is not to be violated by infidelity. A man is responsible to love and care for his wife more than his parents. 8. Thou shalt not steal. Every person has a right to the ownership of private property. Any act, directly or indirectly, whereby we wrongfully acquire something belonging to another person is forbidden. Our dealings with men are to be honest. 9. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Failing to protect the truth is the command most frequently and unconsciously broken. This includes slander, gossip, tale-bearing without careful investigation, leaving a false impression, exaggeration, flattery, or failure to defend one who is unjustly criticized. 10. Thou shalt not covet. We are not forbidden to desire houses, spouses, cattle, or property, but we must not desire what is already possessed by another. This command reveals the hidden depths of an evil heart and exposes the root from which many other sins grow. God had approached Israel as closely as possible, yet nearer than they could tolerate. His presence struck terror in their hearts and they pled with Moses to mediate for them. God granted their wish, then foretold the coming of a prophet greater than Moses. I will raise them up a prophet from among their brethren, like unto thee, and will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak unto them all that I shall command him. Deuteronomy 18 verse 18. While Moses was basking in God's presence on the mountaintop, a disgusting scene unfolded below. After only a few weeks, the people became impatient. Where was their leader? Demanding a visible replica of the Lord, they persuaded Aaron to make an image of gold. Like many leaders today, Aaron pleased the people rather than God. The women's golden ornaments were melted and molded to form a calf. Eagerly the people offered sacrifices to their new idol. They also rose up to play, meaning immoral sexual activity found among the Canaanite worship of Baal. So quickly had their covenant been broken. When Moses saw the disorderly, immodest crowd singing and dancing around a golden image, he broke the 2 holy tablets into fragments upon the ground. Boldly he commanded the idol to be ground into powder and then cast into Israel's drinking water. A second set of tablets were later given to Moses by God. It remained in the Ark of the Covenant for many centuries. Standing at the main gate of the camp, Moses demanded, "Who is on the Lord's side, let him come unto me." Immediately the sons of Levi responded. They then were sent through the camp and slew 3,000 who were still reveling in idolatry. The law is like a thermometer. It indicates fever in the body, but cannot administer a cure. Like a mirror, it clearly reveals the dirt and blemishes, but cannot cleanse. Only the new covenant of grace could restore man's sinful condition. Jesus' blood provided the remedy for what the law diagnosed. God bless you.